Hello, this is Matt Montgomery, Burris Sales Agronomist, and today we venture into the third and final part of our series on nematodes. In Session 1, we reviewed the anatomy of a nematode. In Session 2, we discussed soybean cyst nematode, perhaps the most infamous nematode in row crops, and today, in Session 3, we'll talk about corn nematodes. You may remember this diagram from Session 1, our discussion on Nematode Anatomy. We'll stop for a second right here, though. If this isn't looking familiar, you probably haven't tuned in to Session 1, and you should probably find some time to do so. Watch Session 1 first, and then come back to Session 3. While we talked about lots of nematode parts, a part or two will actually be important today. The most important of those is that needle-like mouth part located toward the bottom of the screen here called the stylet. Remember, plant parasitic nematodes all possess stylets, and the stylet can sometimes be used for identification. This is by no means a complete list of corn nematodes, of all the possible corn nematodes that could work on a crop, but it does suffice for our discussion. It catches the more important types of corn nematode. I guess that really brings up our first point. The term corn nematode is really an umbrella term that's used to describe many different species, often native to the U.S., and those species tend to damage corn. Soybean cyst nematode is one species that hits beans, but corn nematodes are actually many things, many species. Point 2, just to organize this talk a little, we're going to work our way from the longest to the shortest of these corn nematodes. I've included a slide of soybean cyst nematode, SCN, that we discussed in our last session, a soybean pest, and I've really done that here for one big reason. Because we introduced you to SCN, we find it convenient to compare the length of many of these different corn nematode species to the length of SCN. For that reason, we lifted this slide from our last presentation to remind you that SCN is very small, not much longer than the period at the end of a sentence. You can see their size compared to the tip of a ballpoint pen in this slide. Keep that size, that diameter in mind as we describe the length of various corn nematode species. I've also included slides like this to begin us out with, slides that show what nematode injury can look like. Oftentimes, corn nematode injury will appear as unexplained, stunted, or less than vigorous areas in a field. I've often said that if you cross all the other items off the list, you might want to explore corn nematodes as an explanation for a poor yielding area that you just can't explain. Occasionally, when certain corn nematode species have really chewed on a plant, you see clubby roots that appear to brown at the tips. Sometimes the feeding has been so bad that the root literally is leaking sap, causing it to form mud that clings to the root in an otherwise dry soil. Now, we said we were going to work our way from the longest corn nematode to the shortest, and that's exactly what we're doing. You see here our slide on the needle nematode. I want you to note that the scientific name includes the word long, Longiodorus. These are just really, really long nematodes. You can see their eel-like, worm-like appearance in the credited photo, an appearance typical of most corn nematode species. Yet this thing is unique in that it's a really, really long eel. Needle nematodes are probably one of the most damaging nematodes in corn. Yet they're kind of picky. They're going to prefer cooler, moist soil conditions and large pore spaces. That makes sense because they're long, Longiodorus, and they need space to crawl around without damaging themselves. This means that they love sandy soils, and it means that they disappear down into the soil profile as soils warm up. Ideal sampling is really going to be before the calendar is done with May and after the calendar is done with September. About one of these and a half a coffee cup of soil is enough to cause economically significant injury. Rotation does help manage these. Now, before we move on, I want to reference a term on this slide because it's pretty important to understanding why corn nematode management becomes a little more intense than SCN soybean cyst nematode management. That term is migratory ectoparasite. That's a fancy term for feeding and then moving around. So it feeds and moves and feeds and moves and feeds and moves. That's really different from soybean cyst nematode, which feeds and permanently attaches. SCN doesn't move around. We can therefore kill cells to which SCN is attached and kill SCN in the process. That's how resistant beans work. That same thing doesn't work on corn. If we killed cells in proximity to feeding by the corn nematode, that corn nematode would simply move to a new location and begin again. Remember, needle nematodes are long. They're roughly 8 times the length, the diameter of SCN. Next down in size is the Dagger Nematode. This is still pretty long compared to SCN, about 3 times the length on a Dagger Nematode when you compare it to the diameter of a soybean cyst nematode. It also has a long needle-like mouthpart or stylet. That stylet is so long that this nematode actually has a ring that helps guide the needle through the mouth. Otherwise, it just might go through the side of the nematode itself. Incidentally, needle nematodes, we're talking about dagger nematodes right now, but needle nematodes that we talked about just a second ago had a really long stylet and guide ring as well. Because these are so long, working ground actually disturbs them and helps manage them. While dagger nematodes are a potential pest of corn, they're not nearly as bad as the needle nematode that we started things out with. A density of 1 needle nematode per a half coffee cup of soil was a big deal. You have to have a couple hundred of these per a half coffee cup before folks get too nervous about dagger nematodes. Once again, notice that these are not immobile. These are migratory ectoparasites just like the needle nematode was. Our next species of corn nematode is only slightly shorter than a dagger nematode is. These are called lance nematodes, genus Haplolaemus. They don't have the long stylet like our first 2 species did. They do like sandy soils like our first 2 species did. They probably take a few dozen to 100 or more of these per half coffee cup of soil before we really get to see much yield impact. They're different than our previous examples in some important ways, though. Notice that they're ecto and endoparasitic. That means they feed on the outer tissue, as do needle and dagger nematodes, but they also will burrow into the root and cause injury. They also survive on various weed species, so it's hard to keep these in check with rotation like you did with needle nematode. To be honest, nematologists probably have a hard time figuring out what portion of yield loss is by the nematode or by disease that sneaks in through the wounds caused by lance nematode. Spiral nematodes are very similar both in size and in host range to lance nematodes. They feed on enough weed species that it's really hard to keep them in check with rotation. They're probably not a big yield reducer, though. Stubby root nematodes are also kind of rare, almost a non-issue when we examine yield losses in corn, at least in our area. While they're a big deal in other parts of the U.S., they're probably just not a big player in the Midwest. They're about the same length as a soybean cyst nematode. They move around, and they have a unique scalpel-like curve to their stylet. They slash and slurp plant material. Finally, we've come to the smallest group on our corn nematode list, Cradolincus, the Lesion Nematode. As the name implies, they move around and form lesions on the root, brown spots, as they burrow into the root. Once again, that's what the term migratory endoparasite means. It means that they move around and they feed inside. This is actually a fairly wide group. We use the term lesion to really refer to the genus to which a bunch of different species belong. The members of that species are about half the length of a not yet pregnant female soybean cyst nematode. And while they often appear with the other nematode species in sandy soil, they also can appear in various soil types throughout the Midwest. The host range is also pretty broad. It would actually be easier, I think, to make a list of what lesion nematodes do not feed on. Weed control is important to help with management, but given that broad host range, nematicides in corn can become pretty important for managing this one as well. Rotation isn't going to work so well to manage this one, again, because of that broad host range. Now, their injury and how they promote pathogen entry into the root will cause those yield losses that we see, any yield losses we see from them. Think of this being damaging when we hit maybe dagger-like numbers, i.e. a couple hundred of these small guys per a half coffee cup of soil. Well, that completes our session on corn nematodes and our series on nematodes in general. Stay tuned for more in-depth agronomic information on Burris Agronomy U.